Hello, I am Rogerio Pinto. I am the Associate Dean for Research and a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. Last spring, I began a series of online forums about the COVID-19 pandemic and issues of stigma. Who was being affected by the pandemic? How were they being treated? What abiding inequities were suddenly being highlighted by the pandemic? On May 25th, 2020, an African American man, George Floyd, died at the hands of Minneapolis police. This event was almost immediately recognized as a turning point for race relations in this country. Less than a month later, Laura Abrams, professor of social welfare and department chair at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and Allan Dettlaf, dean of the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston, both together wrote an open letter to the National Association of Social Workers questioning the idea that social workers should collaborate with law enforcement. With COVID-19 still as backdrop, I invited Drs. Abrams and Dettlaf and other guests for the discussion of the role of social work in policing. I hope you will enjoy this rich and far-ranging discussion. I would like to thank all of those who originally participated and thank you for watching.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me today. So it is, there's been a lot going on, obviously, in response to the murder of George Floyd, and in terms of social work education and our leadership. There's been several competing and kind of paradigms about what social work should do in relation to law enforcement. So just to rewind, everything's been happening very fast, but to rewind 1 week before we penned the open letter on Medium, I was asked to speak about diversion of city funds in LA to the press, and in terms of like the police taking over social work roles and what we should do about it. I started to, and my background is in criminal justice. So I started to think about this and was writing an op-ed to the LA Times about why social work is different from law enforcement and how social workers are not going to be the saviors of law enforcement if law enforcement continues to operate within its current paradigm of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. That week, Trump posed an executive order about policing, and NASW appeared to endorse it at first with a tweet with Donald Trump's picture and a kind of a, this is social work's moment. And so I thought, okay, this is interesting, but if social work continues to align with this reformist position, then we're not moving the needle in terms of our commitment to social justice and anti-racist practice and policy. So I called Allan, who I know very well, and we've done some work together. And I thought, this is the time to lead as social work chairs and deans and directors. Our students want us to lead too. So why not make a public statement? So just really quickly, we called for NASW to take a stronger stand to reject Trump's executive order, but also to endorse the Black Lives Matter position around divestment and defunding of policing. We had 5 position points. we know that social work is not unified in its response to working with or against law enforcement, shall we say. But at the very least, we think that there are abolitionist strands in our profession that aren't always heard, and that we need to have a more serious conversation about the defunding position, which social work has, the leadership has kind of taken a step back from, I think, and not publicly endorsed Black Lives Matter policy platform. So we put it out there, and just with a couple tweets, we got over 1,100 signatures in a few days. So I'll pass the baton to Allan, because I was hoping, I hope I gave some context.
Thanks first for the invitation to be here. And thanks, Laura. That was a great kind of context of what the events leading up to the letter. I think the other thing that we tried to convey in the letter is that we think that we as a profession need to be careful in thinking that we're this magic solution to ending racism in law enforcement if we rush in and take over some of their roles. We as a profession and as social workers haven't reckoned with the racist origins of our profession and the racist outcomes that we see in most of the systems that we work. My background's in the child welfare system, which has for decades had seen horrible racist outcomes impact Black and brown children, and specifically Black children. We've known for decades that Black children have been overrepresented in child welfare systems. And we also know that the child welfare system began in the late 1800s, early 1900s as a system designed to help and support white children, and intentionally excluded Black children from that system. And then over decades, policies and practices were developed to reinforce that, to intentionally exclude Black children and to support white children. That has changed in our history, where Black children are now over-included rather than excluded, but it's the result of racist policies that have been developed in that system for many, many years. So I think sometimes social workers think that we don't have biases, or we're better equipped to deal with some of these issues with racism than other professions. But I think we need to take a step back and look more critically at the origins of our profession, what we're teaching our students. Are we talking about the racist origins of our profession? Are we really approaching our education from an anti-racist lens? Because I don't think we collectively have done a good job of that. So I think we need to take a step back and critically look at our own profession and that racist outcomes that we see in the systems we work, because we as social workers are the ones who are creating those racist outcomes.
So my name is William Lopez. I'm clinical assistant professor in the School of Public Health. So thank you as well to the panelists and to everyone for inviting me on what is largely a discussion of social work. I'm happy to be here, and I take the role seriously. I think Allan and Laura really gave some, encouraged us to think of the context of social work, but also the context of policing. And I find it incredibly important as a public health professional to think of the context and the history of policing and where we've ended up with, what we've ended up with today. To briefly tell you how I ended up looking at police, because I think it's really relevant to what I'm about to say. I wrote a dissertation, and when I was doing my work, I was looking at the impact of an immigration raid that happened a few miles from where we all sit at the University of Michigan, or from where many of us sit at the University of Michigan. And part of that work was writing along with police officers to see how they talked about deportation, right? But I was doing this in 2014 and 2015. And if you remember where we are then, or where we were then, Eric Garner was killed in 2014. Michael Brown was killed in 2014. Laquan McDonald was killed in 2014. In Washtenaw County, Ora Rosser was killed in 2014. Tamir Rice was killed in 2014. Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, all killed in 2015. So while I was writing with officers, learning about immigration, what they wanted to and tended to talk about was Black Lives Matter movement, whether they called it that or not. And lots of what I saw was the rhetoric used to deport and detain immigrants was the same as the rhetoric used by police to arrest and imprison Black men and women. And not only was the rhetoric the same, right? So we think of rhetoric of criminality. Latinos might be narcotraficantes or drug traffickers, while Muslims, for example, may be quote unquote terrorists, right? This same fear mongering. But sometimes the literal tools were the same too. In the raid I studied, a no-knock warrant was used because of alleged drugs in the house. And if you all remember, a no-knock warrant was just used in the killing of Breonna Taylor for the same thing, right? For drugs in her apartment, alleged drugs in her apartment. So as I started to see, not only was the rhetoric and the tools used to enforce oppression on these two communities, but there was times that one agency would borrow from the others, and we see this in the rallies here after the killing of Floyd. CBP, a Customs and Border Patrol drone, was used to monitor protesters, right? ICE officers were sent to help protect law enforcement during these protests as well. So we see ICE engaging in stopping these protests, just as we see police, especially under the war on drugs rhetoric, engaging in immigration enforcement. So the last thing I'll say, I just like to, thinking of the historical perspective, briefly, I teach a lot about health inequities, and I will often say that the disparate maternal mortality rates when Black women are giving birth, Black women are much more likely to die giving birth than white women. And universally, when students and professors hear this, they're like upset, and they say, what can we do? What can we fix? And I say that same thing about police. Police are more likely to kill Black folks, Native American folks, and Latino folks. And almost universally, folks start getting defensive, right? So why are you attacking the police? Why are you attacking? And they'll say individual police officers they know. But nobody tells me about individual doctors they know. And I say this because I think it's extremely important that many folks find, sure, they know a good officer, there was a good officer in the family, they know a good doctor, but the disparate rate of maternal mortality is unjust, just as the disparate rate of police killing is unjust, right? Even if you know individual officers. So I invite us to think historically, systemically of the outcomes of this profession, as well as we're thinking about how we collaborate with them.
I know when I first heard the discussion about social workers being brought into the conversation or Department of Policing, I was extremely alarmed, as I am whenever anyone uses social workers as the patch fix for racism or any structure within our institutions. I always ask the question, well, what social workers? As a student in a social work program, I see a array of folks that come into these programs for an array of different agendas. And I always question, like, in this profession, we have moved to this very formal, very professionalized system of social work. But the folks that we are letting into these programs don't really align with a lot of things that individual programs or MSW programs overall are advocating for or saying that they align with. I know one thing that I will echo that was in kind of the MSW student demands, as well as the PhD student demands, as well as the letter that was written to NASW, was the need and the idea that social work hasn't addressed our own history. We don't really talk about it. We don't really talk about the history of us and negatively affecting Black communities, like man and house policies, and those policies that smally year after year like dismantled the Black family structure and things like this. And also, no one rarely talks about the effect that social workers had in Indigenous populations of removing children from their families and pushing for white families to adopt these kids as a way to continue the genocide of this individual population. Until we start really addressing and fixing our own problems and frameworks of us upholding white ideologies and white institutions, I really don't see right now how we should be aligning ourselves with police and the criminal justice department that has a very strong and culture that often influences and guides people to often drift off their path of what they might enter that section with or for. And that's coming from my own experience of having a criminal justice degree and getting into criminal justice to really look into the system, because I'm an MSW student. I'm pretty younger. I started college in 2014, where a lot of the murders of Black men and Black folks were really highlighted. And I got into criminal justice to really understand like why police officers weren't going into jail, why were Black folks mass incarceration being pushed into these systems from very young ages. And then my process and journey through criminal justice led me to social work as a way of combining those two entities to answer some questions for myself and possibly for my community and the society as a whole. So yeah, like the whole understanding of history and engagement and like how all these things fit together, I think social work has a long way to go.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, the other panelists who've spoken, Jamie, my fellow student. And so I am entering my 4th year as a doctoral candidate in the joint PhD program in social work and social science that we have at Michigan. My social science is anthropology. And I received my MSW from Michigan as well. I completed that in 2016. And while I was in my MSW, I had 2 different field placements because of the particular international social work track that I was on. The first was a field placement here in the US. It was an in-school intervention with mostly Black girls and girls of color. And my second field placement was in Australia in a foster care agency working with Aboriginal youth. And in both of those cases, I was coming in as a white student to be social worker, and I didn't really have rigorous critical language for assessing the entirety of those dynamics and my particular role in them. And so while I was in my MSW, I started pursuing a certificate in African American and diasporic studies in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies here at U of M. And in as much as I support, that the AFAM studies department, I think, it's unfortunate that in order to develop a critical vocabulary about critical race theory, in as much as it relates to social work, to go outside of our school for that is kind of a lacuna. We have the opportunity to be engaging critical race theory here, and we absolutely have to. I think that it's really important that in as much as social work, especially a Master's of Social Work program, is a professionalization project, we have to confront the fact that social work is very much tied to white feminism and professionalization of white women. We have to look at that, especially since the majority of people who pass through MSW programs to this day are white women. So there's a critical intersectional component that we have to deal with, which is the role of white feminism. And the ways in which white women as social workers historically have served as kind of handmaidens to the state, and the ways in which we as social workers are often positioned as state agents, and the ways in which we have a history of targeting and surveilling Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So there's a lot to work with. Currently, my dissertation research doesn't explicitly grapple with all of some of the topics that I just mentioned. However, from a pedagogical standpoint, and particularly from a professionalization standpoint, it's really important that we grapple with the history of our profession, as all of the panelists have said. I think that, as Allan and Laura's letter said, we're excited that there's so much attention and even material resources being directed toward the social work profession in this moment where social work has kind of come to the fore as the ideal alternative, even like the sort of utopian alternative to policing. And I think that we can seize on this as a moment to radicalize social work. However, I also think it's very telling that the kind of, in the public imagination, social work is seen as this kind of faultless savior. I mean, that word is obviously a big part of our profession that we have to grapple with, but that it is not a sort of instrument of the state in the same way that policing is. And we have to grapple with the fact that we are, and how can we negotiate that, if not radicalize that entirely?
Well, I don't, as you said, there really isn't one answer. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is among students and a younger generation, not my generation, there is new language that CSWE and NASW have not incorporated into the ethics and the learning objective of our profession. So I think while our leadership is a bit stuck in cultural competence and cultural humility and cultural awareness and multiculturalism, which was an advance from not having those ethics, right? Our students have like moved way beyond that to critical theory and positionality and dismantling white supremacy and naming white supremacy and anti-racist praxis, you know. So if we're not using that language, the newer critical race language, we're not keeping up with like Nina said, what's really happening around in the structures of racism that we need to be really thinking through more carefully. That said, that's only one piece, is kind of what we name and what we know. So lately, I've been looking at, you know, if we're writing a letter to NASW or writing a letter, an open letter, use the terms racist, use the term anti-racism. Don't couch things in bias or competency, you know, and I think that just that from the leadership perspective can start to change the discourse around what we are doing as social workers. But that language has not been incorporated yet into NASW and CSWE and the people that kind of lead how we think and talk about social work curriculum and practice. So our faculty, for example, decided not to wait until CSWE develops an anti-racist EPAS competency. We're going to write one ourselves and put it into the curriculum as one of our steps at UCLA. Why wait for it to be a CSWE mandate? We can add on to the foundation competencies. You're allowed to do that, or the advanced competencies. But again, what you said is really important. Just because it's in the syllabus does not mean that we know how to teach these issues. And most of our faculty are not trained to have those discussions, especially when students are coming in with such disparate experiences and views. And faculty haven't, and students don't agree upon necessarily how they're going to talk about race and racism in the classroom, which should be in every class, not just the one class on diversity, so to speak, you know. But Allan, I think over there, has been ahead of this in terms of leading Houston, where I think other folks were like trying to catch up, so I think I'll pass the baton.
Yeah, so I think as you've both mentioned, there is a role for curriculum and our bigger educational professional organizations to play. At the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston, we've been engaged in anti-racist efforts for several years now to try and really reinforce that with our students in terms of curriculum changes that we've made, outside of the classroom educational experiences that we try to provide to our students. And really, we view social work education as teaching our students to be anti-racist activists. I tell all of our students that's my expectation of them when they graduate. But I think, as you mentioned, Rogerio, it goes beyond what education can do. I think we really need to be focusing on the systems that we work in and how we as social workers are complicit in the racist outcomes that we continue to see in those systems. You know, I think I wanted to mention something that Nina said earlier. You know, I think there's this idea that the reason why social workers are having this moment in the media and what some people think is this response is because we're viewed as being helpful as social workers. I think that's true among white people. I don't think that's true among communities of color. I don't think that social workers are viewed as helpful among communities of color at all. I think, as I mentioned, I work in the child welfare system, or I worked in the child welfare system. And I think because that system is so synonymous with what social work is, obviously you all know social work does much more than child protective services, but the Child Protective Services system is viewed by many people as equivalent to law enforcement in many ways. It's viewed as a system of family regulation. And I think we need to really look at the policies and the practices of those systems that create and reinforce racial inequities. In the child welfare system, for decades now, we've applied an intervention to children and families to address a problem that actually causes more harm and trauma to the children that we're trying to help. I think those are the kind of things we need to be looking at. We have policies and practices in place in the systems that we work in that forcibly and involuntarily separate children from their families and actually causes more harm and trauma than anything that was happening in those families before social workers became involved with them. That's where I think we need to be looking at the systems that we work in and how they're continuing to oppress people of color. That's how we take it outside of just the education and curriculum. It's the systems that we work in are the problem.
Sure, I think you're focusing on calling and thinking of it as police profession and perhaps as social work or even public health profession is really telling. So when I was doing this work and what I was witnessing and researching is police continue to refer to this as a calling. And often when we're doing this kind of ethnographic work, we see things happen that don't make sense. And then eventually when we see them all together and think of them all together, it's like a puzzle. It starts to make sense. And one of the things I saw is that police officers continued to talk about when they would save animals, right? One officer said like, oh, the back of the police station is my favorite place because look, we have a dog kennel, we save dogs there, right? Then there was other situations in one, and if you read the book, it's a fairly powerful story, but I won't go into it now. An officer stopped a car to get a turtle out of the road. And then when they wouldn't talk about animals, they would also talk about these kind of exemplary populations and something that would happen that would violate them, right? So one example is a World War II veteran whose coin collection was stolen, right? And they kept doing this and they kept doing this. And as I put it into perspective, what was happening is that officers were often showing, and this is what the research says as well, that they are the people who protect the innocent, right? And these animals that they found in the street were innocent. People like older adults were innocent. But what I really had to come to understand is that in a place in which police first started to enforce the slave trade, and then followed up even after in the Jim Crow South existed to keep white folks in white spaces and black folks in black spaces. That is, for centuries, what police saw as breaking the law was black skin out of place because it literally was breaking the law, right? So in this world with this historic context, we start to see that if police are heroes and there's an innocent population, which is often children or women, where do black folks, where do undocumented folks, where do Latinos fit in? And often they could only fit in this role of the villain, right? The person who had to be stopped to keep these other people safe. And I'll just give one more example, and then I'll stop. But often when officers were talking about the killings of folks during the Black Lives Matter, they would always say what a threat the person was, right? So Michael Brown was a bully. And there was just no way that these black men who were killed and women, at the time black men who were killed, could be anything other than the villain in this historic policing narrative, right? And so to go back to where we were, I often think of my, perhaps social, in your field, social work, but my field of public health, and what is the historic roots of that field? Where does race play into it? And what am I playing in that role? And who are the populations I'm serving? And do I need to change that or adjust it or reconstruct how I'm thinking about this?
Well, here I am, a social work student that came into social work from criminal justice, from that framework. And here I am feeling kind of out of place because curriculum that's happening right now isn't aligning with like what the students, specifically a lot of students of color and folks that are interested in co-liberation work, are getting into and wanting and needing to learn about and wanting guidance in. And I know for myself, I decided to take that risk of, well, I'm going to critique this institution. This is something, I'm in an institution that thrives itself as the #1 school of social work, which I want it to be. And it needs to be. All schools of social work needs to be the #1 school of social work. And in aiming for that goal, you need to start adapting and not even adapting, radically changing this historic system that you were built upon. I had a conversation with folks that were students many years before I was, about things that they wanted and demands that they had that aligned a lot closely with the Black student MSW students here, demands of like what we wanted for change within administration, change within curriculum, funding changing. And as a person of color, there's always a risk of when I choose to critique a white institution and choose to use my voice. I'm 23, graduated in December, looking for jobs. It was a very big risk of doing that self-critique and self-reflection within the system that I am a part of. And I know for me, when I think about going back to the question that was a few minutes ago, like, where do we start? Like, how do we get to this or get further than this? I personally look a lot into admissions. And I also look into like the professors and lecturers that we have. Like a lot of these schools and institutions have amazing lecturers, so amazing history that might align with the direction that was in the past, but now in this era of radical thinking, radical change, defunding the police, dismantling racism, and pushing for anti-racist work, there is a need for new kind of thinking, a new kind of radical professor or lecturer information. I think that especially MSW programs need to start looking within their faculty of like who can uplift this new need, this new change, this new direction of our society. And also with admissions, I look at a lot of my cohort. I know folks who are BIPOC that had to interview to get into this program. These are folks with military backgrounds that came and went back to school, or someone that's a Latinx folks from California who worked herself up, went to teach in DR, teaching middle school students or high school students, and still had to work a lot harder than a lot of the white students who are coming into this program without a sense of what racism is, without a sense of what intersectionality is, very, very minimum information that they were chosen for spots over even white individuals who might have been further in this work. So I think within social work programs, specifically MSW programs, we really have to start looking into our admissions process and saying like, well, this is the direction that we're going to. First off, I would like to say that myself and my org ABSW within the School of Social Work, like we helped hang up a sign at the beginning of the year that reads, at Michigan Social Work, we believe Black Lives Matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Love is love. Environmental justice is social justice, and community is everything. We push the school to display this as a way of living and breathing these anti-racist things that in pods that we were pushing. I think someone earlier, maybe in a conversation that I had with someone else, emphasized that we need to be not just in our professional life, but in our personal life, really living as social workers through these frameworks and with these beliefs now. Like things are outdated and we need to all evolve, and those who can evolve should be pushed to the side or removed, but there's a need for more radical liberation work. And I really think that the future of social work, the future of our progress and us becoming all that we inspire this profession to be as fundamental pillars of our society, on top of like that initial work that we need to do to address our history and dismantle our own white supremacy ideology. Like, we really need to start professionalizing and really honing in on our missions and who we are uplifting as social workers.
A lot of what I have to say affirms and reiterates everything that Jamie just said it so beautifully. I think one of the things that we need to do is when we've kind of reached a point where we can't really teach anti-racist or anti-oppressive content without doing so through anti-racist and anti-oppressive pedagogical means. The irony or the hypocrisy in teaching content, teaching a syllabus that holds anti-racist and anti-oppressive content while failing to enact those practices inside the classroom as that content is being taught is a problem. And I think we've reached a point kind of as an academic community where that's no longer acceptable. I know in many cases, there's been calls for sensitivity trainings as something that often police are called to undergo. And other people in power have been called to undergo different kinds of bias trainings, et cetera. But I think we're past the point where a sensitivity or a bias training is enough. I think we have to take on a pedagogically, an anti-oppressive pedagogy. I've been in spaces very recently where we are talking about reformatting or decolonizing syllabi. And even in that very conversation, a BIPOC person speaks and they are ignored, right? So even as we're having these conversations about radicalizing or decolonizing our syllabi, our actions that we're taking in that conversation are still racist. So I think that one of the things that we have to really do is make sure that praxis is at the heart of our pedagogy, of our teaching. We're a praxis-based profession. The content of what we're reading, our theories inform how we act as professionals and how we act as teachers. So that has to be happening in the classroom. And the second thing that I'll say in terms of student organizing is that one of the things that, so the doctoral students put forth a letter to the School of Social Work and to some other deans and to the president of the university. And we wanted to ensure that our process of collectively sourcing and creating this document would be iterative of our goals. So one of the things that we tried really hard to do and are still refining our process around is sort of ensuring that white students or students who hold privilege take up the majority of the labor that's required, even as they work to center, credit, and hold ourselves accountable to BIPOC voices. So I worked closely with a fellow Black scholar who coordinated the letter with me. And I invited her to come to this today instead of me. But I think that it's really important because we had to work together in order for her voice and the voice of my fellow BIPOC colleagues to be at the center of our work, even as we're not asking those people to do the labor of making sure that these tasks are carried out. So I guess those are both sort of two ways of saying that praxis has to be in our classroom. The way that we teach anti-racism has to be done in an anti-racist way. And the ways in which we organize and institutionalize structural change has to be done in an anti-racist way, which finds a balance between centering the voices of BIPOC scholars while having those who hold privilege take up the brunt of that labor.
I think we as schools of social work need to eliminate objective measures that just continue to oppress people. At our school, we eliminated GRE as a requirement several years ago. Next year, we're eliminating GPA as an admissions criteria. GRE and GPA are not measures of academic ability. They're measures of privilege, and we shouldn't be considering those as part of our admissions criteria. And then the second thing, I think we as a profession, following up on what Lorraine said, we need to really grapple with the issue of field education, which is deeply problematic. We can do whatever we want within our educational institutions to make our curriculum anti-racist, but the reality is we're sending our students into racist institutions to learn how to be social workers. Until we figure out a way to address that, we're not going to see different outcomes.